It's time for Straight Talk Live with renowned radio pioneer Edna Howell-Parrish, the television show and podcast dedicated to presenting thought-provoking issues and opinions with the goal of challenging listeners to re-examine their assumptions and expand their opinions and give thought to new ideas and concepts to better their lives and the lives of others. This is your opportunity to participate in making the world better. So without further ado, let's get ready for Straight Talk Live with your host Edna Howell-Parrish.
To the show today. Hi, everybody. I'm Edna. The Black Family History Chats continue. Today, my guest is my cousin, Crystal Combs White from Michigan. Welcome to the show again, Crystal.
Thank you, Cousin Edna. I'm happy to be here.
I'm liking that new look. I love that.
Thank you.
Ready for the spring.
Ready for spring. Ready for spring. That's right.
I hear you. You know, the Combs, Olinger, Cornett, Hogg family history chats discussion started between Crystal and myself in February. We had great expectations, and we started to gather information and started talking about family discussions and why we don't share our family history. Now, we have family reunions and, get together for the barbecue and the fun. Sometimes we talk about cousins and sometimes we don't. But Crystal, we had so many cousins in this program. I call our family reunions program because we just don't know who they all are. Your father, Kenneth Combs, said, we all are Combs. We all are Cornett, we are all Olinger, and we are all Hoggs. That's what your dad said. I didn't understand Cousin Kenneth.
It was always very much a puzzle to me because, as a Combs, I had Combses that were related to me through my paternal grandmother, my father's mother. And then my grandfather, Bernie, was a Combs. So one of the complexities, one of the things that we are left with from slavery is our surname. We were given that name primarily through ownership. So you could have people that have absolutely no relationship to each other that carry the same surname. And that was the case with my grandparents, So Pap, everybody's heard the name Jackson Combs. He's related to me through my grandmother, my father's mother. And then, my father is a Combs. So there were Combses that lived in Knox County, and there were Combses that lived in Perry County, and there's some Combses that live in Pike County, Kentucky. So yes, it's complicated indeed. And I'm like, well, I'm an Olinger, I'm a Cornett. I've got a little bit of all of those strong family names from Eastern Kentucky. So indeed, it was hard to understand, but I very much will credit my father with helping me understand that through paper, through that pen and pencil research, going to the library, microfiche, all of that. Through that type of research, I began to understand some of those relations. And sometimes it still takes a little bit of talking back and forth, maybe to cousin Edna, my cousin Jock, who's done some research. My cousin Cheyenne Cornett filled me in on a lot of research recently. So just putting those pieces together has been some work, but I love it.
Indeed. Well, Crystal's family history kind of mirrors mine because we're all from the same lineage of people. So we could all say that and from the same parts of town. So this chat has been so interesting. Starting out, we didn't know who we would get. But I tell you, as we have gone on, we have gotten so many Combs family reunion cousins. We have finally found some Hogg family members. Viola Hogg definitely says she's going to be on the program. And then we're going to pay tribute to her family member, the great Houston Hogg, of football fame, one of 4 black football players that went to college and played college ball and went on to do great things. Going to have him on. And then we also have, that Cornett family. I tell you, I got a hold of our Cornett cousin and Herbert Cornett. He lives in Montgomery, Alabama. They have a big reunion coming up in Alabama this summer. Awesome, man. And so he said, okay. And before I knew it, we connected. He got me a lot of members going to be on the panel, and that's going to be next Sunday. So we will continue to talk about that as well. And while we're doing these family chats, sometimes we even forget to honor people in our family. So today, we talk about your dad, Kenneth Combs, and the work that he's done and the legacy that he has left with us for family and community. You're going to pay tribute to your dad. This is also March ending, but this whole month of March has been March Madness basketball, Sweet 16. And how could the Combs family not talk about the Sweet 16 and our cousin, the one and only Jim Rose? I mean, who's going to speak for Jim Rose? And I tried to get others. I said they couldn't come, they couldn't speak, but I'm going to speak for him today. So we're going to talk about that as well. We also have found some other members of the Olinger family that are going to be on the family chat. So we're going to get started today with all of this great information. And as we build foundations today, is for the future as well. Our children's children will be part of this too. So the big question was for our people, why haven't we talked about it? We know one thing about the issue of slavery and the cruelty to men and women that were enslaved. So that's part of the show. So if you are triggered by discussions about rape, if you're triggered by pictures of forceful abuse of men and women, we'll have some of that up, but we're not doing it as a pornographic feature. It is because it is history. And we're going to talk about that today on the show. And finally, a tribute to my good friend, the late Peter Winston out of Cincinnati, Dayton, Ohio, who passed away some 15 years ago. And Peter, you're talking about thug life. Peter was a former pimp. He was a thug. I mean, I did a feature on him that still holds true today. He passed away, but we're going to play that in the middle of the show. So we want to honor him and his children. They're not related to us, but nonetheless, it is very important to honor those that we remember too. So let's begin with the program for today. Crystal, I want to pay tribute to Jim Rose and the March Madness and Sweet 16. Who was Jim Rose? Out of Hazard, Kentucky. And people say, well, a little small town and coal mining town in Hazard, Kentucky. Well, Jim Rose was from Hazard, of course, but he is remembered as the Hazard Bulldog Guard, who was so phenomenal. He helped lead Hazard to 3 consecutive Sweet 16 appearances in 1964, 1965, and 1966. He was named All-State in 1965, 1966, again in 1967. Jim Rose. He's a cousin, and we're going to pay honor and tribute to him as well. Jim Rose was born on May 26, 1947. He passed away June 30th of 2009. He was selected All-State in his team as a freshman in 1964 and was selected to parade All-American team in 1967. He was the 11th overall pick, second round of the Boston Celtics of the National Basketball Association in 1971. Small town boy makes it big. Our cousin did big things, and people just loved him and loved him so much. When Jim Rose passed away, many people had wonderful things to say about Jim. Jim was a special personality, so unassuming, said this person. He was always the same when you met him. I will miss his smile. Love to my cousins, Kenneth M. Combs of Warrensville Heights, Ohio. Do you know him, Crystal?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Your dad's
that is
comment
yep.
about Jim Rose.
Mm-hmm.
Another comment from Lenora Combs from Lexington. She said, James was a very good person and a special cousin. He was always jovial, and we had some great memories and many good times back in the day. He will be missed, especially when I go home on Memorial Day to decorate all the graves, and his will be one of them. Her mom says, to the family, I love you all, and I'm praying for each of you and every one of you. Another cousin, Byron L. Fox of Canton, Michigan, says, cousins, be strong at this time of great loss and trust that God will carry you through. I know that the loss of James leaves a huge physical void in your family, but his spirit will live on in the hearts of all who knew and loved him. God bless you all, from our cousin, Byron Fox. His brother, David Fox, said, I will always cherish the summer that Jim and I spent in Cleveland with baby Elton. That's another one of our cousins. He said, I was proud to be Jim's cousin. May God bless you and keep you during his time of great loss. That's the Reverend Dr. David Fox. And Cameron Linden, one of his nephews, said, Uncle Jim was one of my favorite uncles. If I could speak to him one more time, I would tell him that I love you and you will always be in my heart. Okay. Here it comes from Janetta Warren. Janetta, our cousin in Dayton. She says, I don't know much about basketball until I saw Jim play. He brought so much joy to my family as they all sat together around the TV in hopes of seeing James play. She said, I'd rather have been watching cartoons or something else, but my special cousin was on TV, and that meant the world to my mom, my sister, and my brothers. Jim's kindness was always felt when I came around. And that was from Ann, Benny, Judy, and Janetta, Anne Marie, and Andrea, and Michelle. This cousin, Sierra Daniels Givens, says, I remember the time when we went to our family reunion and Jim fried all the fish. It was banging. LOL, we had a good time and we always keep in touch with our hearts. Love you, Uncle Jim. And then there was a tribute from our family for Jim Rose and all those who love him. So we didn't want to leave that one out. And this comment came from the sports world. He says, our world was a better place because of Jim Rose. The closest a high school basketball team that is, will ever come to pro level was those Hazard High School years with Jim Rose. And finally, who will speak for Jim Rose? Well, his brother Bruce Linden in Hazard, Kentucky said, my brother, my hero, my friend. Everyone knows you as a great basketball player, but not many people know you were a great football and baseball player also. But as a big star, you were. It never went to your head. No matter where you were or who you were with, you were always humble. No matter who you talked to, you never gave the impression that you were the bigger than anybody else. I cherish the times we spent just sitting around and talking. I just love spending time with you. Now you're gone, but I will cherish the times we spent together until we can meet again in heaven. Your body is gone, but your spirit will be with me forever. I love and miss you so much, and you will always be my brother, my hero, my friend. From his brother, Bruce Linden. Who will speak for Kenneth? Who will speak for Jim Rose? Well, all those people were among the many that spoke for him all around the nation. Jim Rose passed away at the age of 62 years old on May 30th of 2009. Many people still remember him, especially the town of Hazard, Kentucky. They made a big to-do about Jim Rose and created the Jim Rose basketball courts in town for him. Many things were named in his honor among those in the city. So we just wanted to just pay tribute to Jim Rose and the basketball courts and city of Hazard and all those who remembered him. He's a great cousin. I wish I had a chance to know him better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So don't be ashamed to ever speak up if somebody asks you to remember a loved one. Don't be ashamed. Because after all, that's why God created us to love one another. And we just love Jim Rose. Jim Linden, but Jim Rose, their name was changed because of their father's discovery later on that he was actually a Linden and not a Rose, but they still related to the Rose family. So Chester Rose cousins, and then many other with that name Rose, part of the family. And I thought it would be a fitting time for you to honor your dad. We talk about Kenneth Combs. Who will speak for him today? His daughter,
I will,
Crystal Combs. Slight.
I will speak for him, but I tell his story so that my granddaughter will tell his story, and perhaps her children will tell the story. So others will tell the story, the cousins. And the way that Edna and I are related is that first cousins married brothers. So I'm sure if we did a DNA test, there'd be all kind of lights pop up because of two first cousins marrying brothers, you know. So there's very much a tie there. And so Edna and I briefly discussed, there are certain surnames in southeastern Kentucky that are all kind of interrelated to each other. And I just gave you kind of one example of that. But my father, who loved his family so much, helped me sort some of that out. And it was through his genealogy research. And this was long before people started using these DNA databases. My father would get up on Saturday mornings, and he worked two jobs for the longest. And when my brother and I got a little bit busier and went high school, and we're busy doing things, my father would go do research at the Case Western Reserve Historical Society. They had an African American group that did genealogical research, and my father ended up being president of that group. But he would go down there and he would use some of the oral history that he sat and heard as a child, and he would look for archives and records. So one of the things that I have are boxes and boxes of genealogy research, birth certificates, death certificates, obituaries, records that he found through his research, and pictures. When I tell people that my brother and I have about 10,000 pictures, those are from family reunions, those are from every milestone kind of in our lives, but they're documents of history. So just a little bit about my father. My father was born November 9th, 1930. He was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. And his parents, his father's name was Burnham and his mother's name was Ethel Cornett. My father's name was Kenneth Combs. My grandfather's name was Burnham Combs. They married in Hazard on April 13th. I just looked it up. April 13th, I think it was 1928. And then they moved to Cincinnati. I have a copy of their marriage certificate. But they moved to Cincinnati. And through census records, we know where they lived. We know what their occupations were. My grandfather was a tailor. My grandmother, who had gone to Knoxville College in Cincinnati, she couldn't find work as a teacher. So she was a seamstress. She occasionally did housekeeping. But I have those records. And my father lost both of his parents by the age of 8. His father died of pneumonia when my father was 3, and his mother died of tuberculosis when my father was 8. Prior to her death, his mother, Nan Cornett, who was the mother of 9 children, came and went to Cincinnati, retrieved my father and his 2 older brothers, Sanford and DeWitt, and brought them back to Hazard, Kentucky to live with her. And so my father was raised in Hazard, Kentucky. And my father loved Hazard, Kentucky. Loved it, loved it, loved it, loved it. I cannot even express how much he loved Hazard, Kentucky. He's buried there now. But he also loved his family. And I grew up hearing stories about Uncle Simon. That's Edna's grandfather. And Uncle Simon stood in the gap for his brother Bernie, my father's father. And my father and his brothers would spend the night at their house all the time. If my father evidently, if he was walking from town and was too tired to go on the other way, he just opened the door and crawl into bed with somebody, just one of his cousins, Lionel, or somebody like that. They all grew up very, very close. And I'm appreciative of that because it is those stories of resilience that help me on my worst days. So when my father graduated from Liberty High School, which he has a whole lot of records of, pictures, archives, which he labeled with names, years, dates, all of those photographic records. He put them in binders, helped organize reunions for Liberty High School. He graduated from Liberty High School. He went to Kentucky State University. He got a bachelor's degree in industrial arts education. He continued his education at Case Western Reserve. He became one of the first licensed packaging engineers in the United States, where you had to be certified and take a test to become that. And so, as a packaging engineer, he was then responsible for creating packaging to help ship lamps and lamps parts for General Electric. And he has seven patents as a result of his work as a packaging engineer. Um, you've probably seen some of his designs without knowing it. When you've picked up a light bulb to change in your house, that packaging that makes it so that it can ship without breaking, that is his design. So I have a copy of some of his patents, a copy of some of the prototypes for those designs, and he was always interested in space and the relationship between space and objects, which I think leads to this space between relatives. You know, if you think about it, the genealogy, how are we connected? My father made a point of attending reunions. Since I was a little girl, we, head to Kentucky. It was generally around it, baseball All-Star week that we'd head to Kentucky. I know there was a cornet union that was always the first Saturday in August that we would attend. I remember going to one in Buckhorn. Occasionally went to one in Dayton with our Combs family. But I grew up in Warrensville, Ohio, along with my brother Kenneth, my mother Colleen Hollyfield Combs, who is from Jenkins, Kentucky. My parents were introduced by my uncle Pearl Cornett, who taught briefly in Jenkins, Kentucky, and introduced my parents to each other when they both ended up in Cleveland. So, in addition to being a packaging engineer, my father founded the Glenville Youth Athletic Association for youth to play baseball, which he loved, in the Glenville area of Cleveland. He was very much a part of his church, very active in the prison ministry there. His church was Antioch Baptist Church. They paid tribute to my father upon his death by making him deacon emeritus. And there's also a halfway house for prisoners that will have a room dedicated to him in that room. So, my father left me the legacy of my family, having my family, and he passed away in 2017. And I was able to spend practically every day with him the month before he died. And during that time, he talked about his journey to Cleveland and some of the things that family supported him on. And one of the things I remember him telling me, and I constantly remember now, is family. That's all we have. And I think that's so true. When your family reaches out to you on the death upon a loved one, like his grandmother went and got those kids during the middle of the Depression, when Uncle Simon stood in the gap for my grandfather. I thought there's a picture of my great grandparents, my grandfather's mother and father. And my father would spend summers with my grandmother. I don't think he had any, I think his grandfather may have passed. I don't know if he had any memories of his grandfather. I don't remember him talking a lot, but it's that grandmother that he spent time with, and some of her memories that he shares with me. So I could go on and on talking about my dad, but that's just a brief.
Right.
Here's that quilt that Grandma Louisa Francis made. Her birthday just passed in March. She she and my grandfather had a small farm in Knott County, Kentucky. She raised sheep. She had vegetables. My father said in her house, she dried all kinds of things. She'd mix different tinctures and concoctions. And one of the things he always said was he wished he'd asked her more about some of those things that she did with herbs and all of that. But anyway, to get back with the blanket she made for each one of her children. And each one of my father's brothers, this was actually my grandfather's blanket. And she gave it to my dad. And my grandfather was born in 1888. And so she made a blanket for each one of her children. And she raised the sheep, she sheared them, she dyed them with from vegetables and fruits that she had on her small farm. And then she wove this quilt. You can see that she patched it with, from the wear, she patched it with another quilt. The design is unique. And typically, when you see a quilt that had been made by a former enslaved person, that quilt would be made in the European aesthetic, where they would take scraps of fabric and create some type of pattern that they have been taught by their enslaver, or, through instructions. But this quilt was totally made from the memories that she had, um, from her mother, from her native Guinea, where our family, our ancestors lived as traders on the west coast of Africa. Traders meaning they made and sold goods to sell to people that were coming along that coastal region. And so that's why we have so many people on the Combs family that work well with their hands or work well with flowers and gardens. Cousin Byron, who is such a great artist, his daughter Meredith. My brother is an artist and very good with garden. That DNA is so strong in our family, that creativity gene, that entrepreneur gene, that storytelling gene, because her blanket very much tells a story. It tells a story of where she was from and who she was as a person. And we can still talk about that now, over 100+ years after her passing and after her journey as an enslaved woman in this country. So we are very proud of what she's left us. This blanket has traveled all over the country. It hung in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. It's been noticeable. It's been written about in several books, but it tells about who she was, her origins, and to just see it and hold it and know that she made it and her kept her children warm is such a gift to all of us, because it speaks to the resilience and the creativity of women in our family despite it all. So I just
I
love the
did
story of
not,
Carter Blake.
yes, I did not intend on showing the quilt, but my
Mhm.
sister Joyce called me today and she said, well, the Smithsonian Institution may have some problems in the future according to what our president may want to do. Now, I
Mhm.
know you were telling me a story that you were prepared to put that quilt back into the Smithsonian. Can you share just a moment about
Yes,
what's going to
yes.
happen and why you didn't do it?
I didn't do my father right before he died. My father died in January of 2017. In September of 2016, he had put together a package of research, pictures of the quilt, some like a resume for the quilt, where it had been written about, who had certified it as an original, piece of work by an enslaved. Because there's less than 100 artifacts that were created by enslaved women that exist in this country, and hers is one of them. And so he wanted it to be in a safe place for future generations, for everybody to share in our creativity. He put together this package to donate it to the Smithsonian, and they never responded to him. And I just look at it like there was a reason why that wasn't responded to, because we surely would have shipped it off to them, and that would have been his wishes. But now there may be a complete undoing of all the artifacts that are at that museum. So I still have the blanket in my possession, and my daughter and I will just really, my daughter and I, my children, we'll just, and my brother, we'll all think about where we think that needs to be, so that people can fully understand and appreciate her journey as an enslaved woman.
Yeah, my sister asked me today, so what the dismantling of African American history, culture, actions, attitude, work, contributions is being dismissed by the present administration. They want to wipe it all out. But we are those who have big mouths that know what we're talking about. We got to keep our eye on that. And that's why these family chats and discussions are so very important. I thank you for your background on your dad. A lot of us know a lot, and a lot of us didn't know a lot. There are people today said, well, what time are you going to discuss the reason why our families don't talk about their history? So I said, well, this is a good time. We'll do it in the half point of the show. So we're at that half point now. So we're going to take a break. I'm going to show the tribute to Peter Winston. This is the man who was a pimp, who was, he was the baddest of the baddest. But he found Christ. Christ found him right where he was at. We went to church together at Solid Rock Church in Monroe, Ohio. Peter Winston.
Welcome to Voices of Courage, life-transforming stories, a candid look at a life-transforming journey. In sharing these testimonies, it is our hope that lives will be transformed and faith encouraged. Now, with this segment of Voices of Courage, your host, Edna Parrish.
Peter Winston is a witness to what God will do when you stand on His word. Peter's young thug life as an illiterate thief, drug dealer, and pimp left him bitter and angry, leading him to serve time in 7 detention centers, state and federal prisons. Today, Christ is transforming Peter. He leads a prison ministry that helps men and women find their way to Christ. Listen now to Peter Winston's life-transforming story.
I had some robberies, I had some forgeries, I had some drug charges, I had some burglaries and some breaking and entries. I knew that God had a call over my life all the time, but I just didn't know how to get there. When I got saved in 1986, not knowing how to read or write, I said, Lord, now you have saved me. Now you need to teach me. So the brothers inside of the institutions that was teachers, apostles of the Word of God, they taught me how to read and write. Then I had a stronger desire to be able to understand that there is another way.
You're raised in a home where there was domestic violence and your dad was not there.
My mom remarried, and that seemed like that's when the nightmare started. I didn't want to accept stepfathers, so I began to wander into the streets. I began to hustle and got with the wrong crowd and began to steal and snatch purses and steal cars and joyride and do things in school, and I began to gang bang. And
in spite of all of this, in the penitentiary, the 7 times you went to prison, you even got saved during the interns and still went bad.
Not having nobody to walk along the journey caused me to go back into the streets.
But it also shows you that God can use anybody for the good, even when the devil meant it for bad.
It's amazing to me now how God had took me through all of what I went through for over 16 3/4 years of my life, and how now and my wife could go back into business all over the world and even out of the country, ministering the Word of God. Last year, we had over 7,000 inmates come to Christ. This year, I'm sure we have probably over 10,000. Every year, it just gets greater and greater and greater.
You all minister in federal prisons, which I understand is something that's normally not heard of.
Yes, we are now currently doing revivals in the federal institutions, and what God is doing in me and my wife's lives now. He didn't only stop there. He called me forth and told me that he wanted me to be a deacon in the church. Seems like I keep growing and growing, and I'm just overwhelmed. Not that I lift up man, I lift up the God that lives and abides within man, and God had to use somebody, and he used them, and I'm just so thankful for it.
What's in you from God that allows you to freely talk about drugs, prostitution?
I know that it was only God that had brought me out of the distress that I had been in all of my life. The God that's in me, it wants to explode, is where God brought me out of, and I enjoy going back into the institutions to share what God has done for me and how God has brought me out and how God could bring others out. The Bible says in Psalm 119 in verse 1 and 2 that blessed is he that keepeth testimony and testify unto those that don't even know God or haven't even heard about God.
The Bible says in Revelation 12:11 that believers overcome the accuser of the brethren by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. Do you have a testimony to share? Do you desire a relationship with Jesus Christ? Get started now by logging on to voicesofcourage.net. That's voicesofcourage.net, where lives are being transformed and faith encouraged.
Okay, we're back. Lives are being transformed, faith encouraged, one person at a time. Only God can do that. And that was really Peter Winston. I created that in 2011. I've done many programs over my lifetime, and so that's just one of them. Many stories that I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have been out there and you've been involved in the thug life, don't think you have to stay there. God can bring you out of it. As we continue with our show today, Crystal, can you tell me why discussing our family history is so difficult for many people? And I asked the question, could sexual assault of enslaved people by their owners be the answer or part of the answer? Why they don't want to talk about it?
I definitely think that that is a huge part of it. You know, I think that a lot of us were taught not to ask questions about certain things, not to ask questions about the past, to accept that sometimes people didn't want to talk about it. But as we move forward, understanding some of the things that have happened to us that continue to affect us, um, become important. You know, and I know it's hard, it's difficult. I think that that's part of the reason why so many of us do not want to um, kind of unlock these family secrets. And they're not really, they're family traumas. When you think about the loss of control that, in particular, women had with their bodies, with having to nourish someone else's child before their own, with having to yield to someone's desire, um, to acts of violence, sexual, acts of violence, unwanted sex with people, um, being sold, just the whole commodification of the human trafficking, just the aspect of having to separate yourself mentally when your child is being sold in front of you. All of these traumas that mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers suffered, they almost became too much to speak about, too much to remember. And so some of this history, a lot of our history, is still kind of embedded in these family secrets. And when someone looks it up, when we look up records or census records, that brings some of that back. You know, a lot of people don't want to talk about it. I just would like to share briefly with you just a trauma that happened within my own family. My grandfather's mother, the story, depending on who you talk to, the story might be told differently. But basically, she had a child with a man she was 13 or 14. This man was well in his 60s. It's basically been portrayed to us through my parents as an unwanted sexual experience with this older man, which I would categorize basically as a rape because she was a child. It was a white man with a very large family in Alabama. And my grandfather was a result of that act. And, if you look at my grandfather, if someone just on sight alone, they would think he was of Eastern European descent. He certainly looked like that. He ended up being the spitting image of that man. But the shame that went along with that for his family, his grandparents, his mother, who ended up dying like at 19 or 20. She died of heat stroke. It might have been something else. Some people say that she acted very different after that. Well, of course she did. How is that translated in a family? How is some act like that? How does that end up presenting itself in a family? And we don't talk about it. He obviously was a result. He obviously had some mixed parentage. He obviously was not connected to his father's family. Now, through DNA, we know who those people are because it shows up in DNA. DNA is not going to lie. And so, how do we navigate all of these family histories? How do we talk about them? Do we talk about them? What do we do with that? I think that's a huge part of genealogy now because we're starting to get more into it where we're discovering these relations. And I was talking about it recently because my mother, through her research, found out that we were related to Coretta Scott King. And people don't know these things because people were sold off, you know, traded. So somebody that was a relative ended up, you don't know this person. You could walk down the street and not know them. It could be your uncle or a brother because they were sold. You don't know anything about it. So how do we talk about this and navigate it in a way that respects our ancestors, respects what they did, but also acknowledge that we are all dealing with issues around separation, sexual assault, and survival? Because my grandfather basically was parentless by the time he was 13. Nobody in his life, you know. He ended up just kind of, wandering his way to southeastern Kentucky to become a coal miner. He was a very joyous person, but I am sure that somewhere underneath there was this. And we all have these stories to tell. Our grandmother that we have in common, her sister had her tongue cut out of her mouth, and for telling on someone. I think about that story a lot. I only know that story because of my father, but everybody else might not know about that story. But it's a horrible story. It's a horrible story. And then you think about women that had to breastfeed other children. We all have to think about these stories and how our relatives either survived, thrived. If we're here, they thrived in some way. But how do our families deal with it? That trauma is still here. It's still here, and it still presents itself in families because we know some things that we're not supposed to talk about. We all know those things.
And there was fear in their lives. They felt like if they told it and somebody heard that they told it, they might get their tongue cut out. They might get the branding iron put on them. They might get whipped 18 times or 45 times. Women did not turn down many times the enslaver. Slave women did not turn down the white man. Many of them didn't. And many of them did, though. But it's caused a lot of problems for families. Can you imagine how a husband, knowing that at midnight the white man's going to come and sleep with his wife? Sad story, but true. Who wants to talk about that? That's why the fear was there. They kept their mouths shut. I don't know if I was talking to you or not, but somebody was saying that's why a lot of times that, oftentimes our parents told us, when it gets dark, you better be home. When the street light comes on, you better be home. The porch light comes on, you better be home. And that's because if you were caught being out on the street, and they knew it from the South, they knew it from all the cruelty that happened to people, you would be killed. You could be hung. Anything could happen to you. And so they were fearful of that. They didn't want to tell that. They didn't want to share that as well. Many women were forced to have babies. They talk about abortion, and they want to talk about African American women. How many times they could not and did not abort those babies? Those children were born from the slave master father, and they became part of the plantation staff.
They became part of that staff, and they would name the children. They would name the children.
Forced to be with the slave master, having children, and the husband just having to look at it, see it, and couldn't do anything about it. Or sometimes women got sick and tired of that happening to them. They would also do the same thing to black men. Black slave men were forced to be with the white women. Are we making this stuff up? Is this a Lifetime story? No, it's true.
Mhm.
So
Mhm. And
who wants to talk
this
about
is
that?
this is why, and people don't talk about the aspect of how men were utilized sexually by enslavers. And this is why, instead of indigenous American DNA showing up in us, it's usually European DNA or something else along those lines, because that's how these relationships would be hidden. Someone would claim Native American ancestry when in fact it was not that. It would be these relationships that were forced on people, and that was part of the shame. Became some story, some hidden family history. It also became. I mean, we could talk about the color uh, bias amongst uh, enslavers and how they were treated differently based on people's color. People were given different duties based on color. So that created some animosity and hostility between us, and that still exists. Some people just went on their merry way and chose to live as white. Some people had to live as black, but all of this is part of that family history. And my grandfather ended up looking a lot like this man that assaulted his mother. So I can't even imagine how this affected her as a young girl.
I was reading from a friend, and I believe that we are related, that she's a cousin, Joe Spencer. She originally was an Olanger. So we know how the Olangers and the Cornets and the Combs mixed. But her book is called Slavery in Southeastern Kentucky, A Buried History. And she was talking about the cruelty of slave masters. Many of those who came into eastern Kentucky, the coal mining towns in the counties of Breathitt and Clay and Harlan and Magoffin, Perry and Owsley County, as well as Wolfe County and Pike County, that many of them came from Virginia, West Virginia at that time, over into this beautiful land of Kentucky where the mountains were there, prolific wildlife. You could kill a deer within an hour coming in. So they began to bring their families in, and many of them came because they wanted that land. They wanted the riches there. But they also brought with them slaves. And they said they were the cruelest people to their slave members and their and colored women, especially and children. They said they came here from North Carolina and they settled and they bought them as slaves. And they said that the very same children that the black women would have, white women knew that their husbands were, having children with these black women. And the white women were so afraid they wouldn't say anything. They didn't want anybody to know. But how can you not know when you see these children running around lighter than everybody else, but you knew? And so sometimes the white women would try to kill the children and drop them down the well and water holes and everything else. They were so mean. And she said that the slave owners from North and South Carolina were the meanest ones. Now, we have relatives that came over, our black relatives that came over from their enslavers from North Carolina.
Yes. Yes. Our grandfather, John, if you look at his records, historical records, a lot of them say John Hogg Combs. He originally was with the Hogg family and then sold to the Combs family. And so if you look at the occupations of a lot of our relatives, they worked in lumber. They worked, and you think about North Carolina, the lumber industry. Our family were loggers. I know my grandfather, Ransom Cornett, um, carried logs from Hazard up the Kentucky River, which is very hard work. But our our grandfather, John Combs, whose name was changed from Hogg to Combs, ran away a lot because he was treated cruelly. And he talked about it, and it was no secret. He was there was even a notation that he was a hard to deal with slave because he ran away because of that mistreatment. So that can be very much documented in our family history, the mistreatment of slaves, and through our genealogy with our names, because technically he was a Hogg and then sold to the Combs, given that name Hogg and then sold to the Combs. So yeah.
all of these stories that we talk about are true. That can be documented through the slave narrative projects that have taken place and interviews of people through the National Humanities Center Resources Toolbox. These things can't be deleted. They're true, and they'll never go away. And that's why I think that today, the present administration wants to wipe everything away that we make positive contributions to in America. You can wipe it away if you want to, but it still lingers and it's still true. It's stories that we have to share and continue to share.
We have to tell these stories so our children know how to proceed and go about in this world, and things that we need to stand up and demand that our history, that our people's stories are told. I am here because our grandmothers, our grandparents, those are people that stood strong. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy by any means, but we are here because of something they did, some way that they survived. That grandfather, our grandfather, John Hogg Combs, recently I've discovered that he was the undertaker when a lot of his children passed away. So, when you think about the trauma that he probably encountered or suffered through as a slave, as an enslaved person. I hate that word slave, so I'm trying to get out of that own trauma of using that word slave. Some of his enslavement, some of the treatment he received.
Yes.
And then the fact that he had to be the undertaker when his children passed away. He had to prepare them for burial and then bury them. And, we have family cemeteries, but just all of the things, the disease that we had to encounter because we couldn't seek medical treatment. And then we had to bury our own and all of that. Our people suffered and endured so much. And we're still navigating it. We're still working our way through it. We're still working 160 years later. We're still working our way through it. And I think that the story of our survival is a strong one. And we need to keep telling it. We need to tell it at least one time at every family reunion. Say the names of those who are responsible for us being here. Tell their stories. Tell those stories of those loggers, the ones that escaped, those ones that told the story, that created things, those genes that we have that are so creative, those storytellers. That aunt of ours who had that tongue cut out of her mouth was a storyteller. She was a storyteller. And here her relative is Edna telling stories right now and being heard all over.
And the same holds true for many families, whether your family are the Jackson families and the Washington families and the Smith families and the Truett families. These are stories that we're sharing. And so I hope that through our sharing these stories and discussions will prompt other family members to be bold enough and to be brave enough to share their stories. You may not have to do it online. Maybe it's in your kitchen table and a couple cousins get together and start talking, writing some things down, coming together for reunions, whether you come together over some church's chicken and, 3-piece or whatever you're going to get, and get together. And maybe it's 10 people this year, and maybe next year you add 10 more. But you continue to do it. Don't give up. And don't say it's too hurtful to remember, because out of the bad comes good. Look at the survival rate of our people. We didn't die out. I mean, we died, but we didn't die out. We didn't stop. So what makes you think that something like what's going on today and what happened then can stop us? Because I'm here today because I'm a Combs, I'm a Cornet, I'm an Olinger, I'm a Hogg. And then there's my father's side of the family who also came from Kentucky. And they came from Black Mary, who was a slave, who was impregnated by her enslaver. And those people surely all were mulattoes. They look white. Many of them left Kentucky because they were afraid to be recognized and people would find out they really had Black in them. So that's a whole nother story that, we share. And we will continue to share and talk about that as well. So I'm not giving up. Not until the Lord says my time is up and I have to leave and go join our ancestors. We'll continue to talk about it.
When I share family stories, I've had people say to me, well, you kind of just share the good ones. No, I'm not sharing the good ones. I share stories that I hope will inspire other people to look at the strengths that we had in our family. That's all. That's all. Because I think that for so long, anytime we saw a story about enslavement or some story, it was always a sad story. And yes, those stories are there, but we're still here. And so if I tell a story, even if I tell it, like my grandmother, she died. My father's mother, she died at 32. Certainly a short life. Her life was not easy at all. But I want to tell the good parts of that story. My grandfather, that was the result of that sexual assault. I want to tell the good parts of his life, because even though people had a lot of trauma, which we certainly need to acknowledge and work through, the end result of that story is you, is you, is you. And some kind of way, somebody went through this so you could be here. So you could be here. So let's acknowledge those parts. Let's acknowledge all of it. Let's acknowledge all of it, because it certainly builds strength amongst our families if we acknowledge everything that we've been through.
I know the bad story. My dad didn't talk a lot about his family history. Mom was white, dad was black. Dad shot when my father was 3 years old because he was with a white woman. They were over from, McGoffin County. Many of the family members, when my daddy grew up with some of his aunts and uncles, they tried to throw him down a well to kill him and his sister because they were mixed race. They used to have to eat grass pie, go out in the yard and pick grass and make pie out. I mean, just the hard time stories that he told that he knew. My family moved from Kentucky, Hazard, Kentucky, when I was about maybe 4 years old, and they moved north to Dayton, Ohio. And so I'm reading from my cousin's book, Slavery in Southeastern Kentucky, and they talked about, well, the black people didn't leave Hazard, Kentucky to come north because they were in the Great Migration. They were ran out of Kentucky. They ran out. So many, that's the stories that he didn't want to tear and talk about it, but he surely left the information in the family Bible. And I knew where it was, and he told me what to find and what to look for. I found it, I looked for it, I researched it, and I found out the story about Black Mary. I know about the Arnett's. I know about my grandmother, who I'm named after. I know about that. I know that history. And so that's why we're sharing it and we're telling it. This is the Combs story we're telling now, but I have another side with my father's family. Before we go, I want to tell the story about the slave girl named Celia, who grew up in Missouri under the Missouri Compromise. It admitted to the Union. She was admitted to the Union as a slave, part of a slave state. Okay. Before the fall of 1822, a man named Robert Newsom, white man, settled on some land in Callaway County, Missouri. So Robert Newsom, age 60, had acquired some slaves. And at age 60, he had a slave girl named Celia. And so Celia was 14 years old. He raped her, had sex relationship with her for 5 years. She gave birth to 2 children that were his for sure. She also had George, who was her husband as much as a husband could be. And George told her to stop having sex with the master. What control did she have over her body? Because she was owned by the master. She got so tired of it. So master came one night to have his way with her, and she fought him off. And she hit him in the head, and he fell, and he died. She didn't intend to kill him, but he died. But she got tired of it. So anyway, they found out that she did it. She admitted that she did. They took her to court. And so Celia, this little 14-year-old girl, bless her heart, So she was tired of it. They even wrote a story about Celia. And Celia's a slave girl. And this is the slave cabin he would come to at night to have his way with her. She admitted to it. She said one night the devil got in her, and she said, I am not doing it again, and she did not. So Mr. Newsom didn't have his way with her. So she had to go to court. And long story short, she admitted that she killed him. And actual trial that happened at the University of Missouri, Kansas City School of Law. This story can be traced back to there. Celia ran away from her slave jail cell. And as soon as they found out, they caught her again. Next day, December 21st, 1855, Celia was hanged in Fulton, Missouri. This young lady, she fought back. She said, devil got in her. I ain't doing it no more. She said, I can't. I am not doing it anymore. Can you imagine the women who had to persevere and what they had to go through? Just one story, but it's true. Mm-hmm. True story.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Without the resources, without anybody to talk to, the shame, the anger, the lack of control.
It is a story that we must tell, and so I am so proud that we're going to be telling it and continue to tell it till we get through with all the families that we have connected with us. Coming up next week on the show, adding to the stage now is our cousin from the Cornett family. That is Herbert Cornett from Montgomery, Alabama, and he's the president of the Cornett family reunion that they're having in Montgomery, Alabama, coming up this summer. And so he said, yeah, I'll be glad to help you. I'll be glad to come on the show. So he's going to come on next week. He's going to have his sister. This is Kim Haskins from Columbus, Ohio. She's going to be on the program as well. We have Patrice Gregory. She's coming on the show. And more that whose pictures I have, but just did not get to bring it up into the show. Before we go, I wanted to make sure that I got them on. So they're coming up next week. And so we're going to have some more of these Cornett stories. These are your cousins, Crystal, our cousins.
No, I know. Pat and Molly Mae, those are their nieces and daughter and all of that. So yeah, I love it. I love it.
I love it too. I love it too.
Keep telling their stories, Uncle Britt. And
we're going to hear some stories. So Herbert told me he found out some good information as well. So we're looking forward to that. Good. Thank you for joining us on the show today, Crystal. I really appreciate you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me, Edna.
And a tribute to our cousin Jim Rose. I mean, that was back when they was playing basketball, still, wearing the little short shorts and all that back in the 60s. But he still nonetheless did a great job. We love him and a tribute to him during this March Madness Sweet 16 era. He played in it. He did his thing, and we really appreciate him. That's the Combs side of us. And there are other Combs members who are also athletic and have done some great things, so we're going to be talking about them as well. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, everybody. And thank you all for joining us. We had a great show today. I like the way we ended the show. And give us tributes and give us the media that we deserve. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Edna Parrish.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Straight Talk Live with renowned radio pioneer Edna Howell-Parrish, the program dedicated to presenting thought-provoking issues and opinions with the goal of challenging listeners to re-examine their assumptions and expand their opinions and give thought to new ideas and concepts to better their lives and the lives of others. Join us next week for another opportunity to participate in making the world better. So until next week, live your best life from your friends at Straight Talk Live and host Edna Howell-Parrish.